In 1747, in an attic room in Gough Square in London, a remarkable literary project was underway. Embracing the spirit of the 18th century, a dictionary had been commissioned. A book that would do for the English language what Newton had done for the stars. Classifying words, fixing their meaning, bringing order to the chaos of language.
If I had a farthing for every cup, he'd be making me tea.
Careful. All day's work there, you know.
9 years in the making, this landmark of English literature was the brainwork of one man.
He was a frightful figure. Huge, shambling, twitching, blind in one eye.
Often his wig would be singed at the front from holding a candle too close to his short-sighted eyes.
Lots of people, when they first met him, thought he was a lunatic, until they were able to talk to him.
Samuel Dictionary Johnson, an unlikely hero, an eccentric, unknown hack writer, destined to become a literary superstar. Samuel Johnson's dictionary is one of the most important books ever written in the English language. In the 250 years since its publication, it has served as a model for dictionary writing throughout the world. Today, rare first editions are proudly preserved in the world's great libraries.
So here is the dictionary. 2 volumes, 42,773 words, over 100,000 illustrated quotations, 2,300 pages. And as you can see, these are huge, cumbersome books. You couldn't pick one of the volumes up with one hand. You might struggle to do it with 2 hands. What's more, I can't even touch this particular copy of it because this was the personal copy of King George III. Usually today when we see a book on this kind of scale, it's something that's been produced by people collaborating, large teams of people who've come together. And when it sits in front of you, like this, you're reminded of what a remarkable accomplishment it was for one man, essentially unaided. This is his work. But it's also a book that's produced by one person who had to overcome incredible difficulties to do that in his personal life, in the life of his mind. We're talking about a guy who had incredible psychological difficulties, obstacles and obstructions to his labours. And this really very orderly production is at odds with that. And that's a tribute really to Johnson's personal qualities.
What we know about the author of this extraordinary book is largely gleaned from one of the most celebrated biographies in the English language, Boswell's Life of Johnson. James Boswell was a young Scottish lawyer who met Johnson some 8 years after the publication of the dictionary. Boswell immediately fell under the author's spell, and for over 20 years he doggedly pursued Johnson, filling notebook after notebook with records of their many conversations, intending one day to publish the story of Johnson's life.
You know, the happiness of London can only be truly conceived by those who've been here. Indeed, I venture to say, there's more science and learning within a circumference of 10 miles of where we now sit than there is in all the rest of the world.
Well, the only disadvantage is the very great distance at which people live from one another.
Oh, well, that's just occasioned by its largeness, which in turn is the very cause of all the other advantages.
There are times when I would willingly leave London, retire to a desert.
Aye, there are deserts enough in Scotland. A man of intellect would never willingly leave London. Nope, when a man's tired of London, he's tired of life, for there is in London all that life can afford.
Johnson's passion for London is legendary. He wrote his famous dictionary here, in Gough Square, a house off Fleet Street, which was, in the 18th century, the very heart of literary London.
Welcome, everybody, to Dr. Johnson's house. I'd like to roll back in time a little bit, just tell you a little bit about Johnson's earlier years. If we could just have a look at the picture on the wall here. Now, this is a rather quirky picture. It's by Johnson's friend Joshua Reynolds. And obviously it's retrospective, as Reynolds didn't know Johnson when he was about 6 months old or however old he is. And you can see even then he's having great thoughts about something. Now, Johnson was born in quite poor health. I mean, he was baptised on the spot and and Johnson himself said that he was a diseased and sickly infant. He contracted scrofula from his wet nurse's milk, which is TB of the lymph nodes. He managed to throw it off naturally, but this was notwithstanding the several rather odd cures, one of which is to have a cut made on the child's arm, which was then not allowed to heal up for several years. But this scrofula did leave him badly affected in terms of his eyesight and his hearing. He described himself as being nearly blind in one eye, and certainly his hearing was very bad as well.
Johnson was born in Lichfield in the Midlands in 1709. The son of a bookseller, he was from the very start a voracious reader. In his sickness, he sought refuge in Greek and Latin classics taken from his father's shelves. But Johnson's mother disapproved of much of his reading, preferring instead to steer him towards Christian texts.
I have this for you. You'll find good things here. Things you'll need. Here. This one. Now don't just read it. Learn it. Know it. You'll find things in here you'll never regret in life, Sam.
When Johnson was a child in petticoats and had learned to read, his mother one morning put the common prayer book into his hands, pointed to the collect for the day, and said, "Sam, you must get this by heart." She went upstairs, leaving him to study it. But by the time she had reached the second floor, she heard him following her. "What's the matter?" she said. "I can say it," he replied, and he repeated it distinctly, though he could not have read it more than twice.
Throughout his life, Johnson was a stern moralist, doubtless the result of his mother's early influence. The family bookshop was equally significant in developing Johnson's precocious intellect, but it failed to generate enough income to send him to university. Indeed, it was only when he was 19 years old that a chance legacy gave the family just enough money to get Johnson started at Pembroke College, Oxford.
This is the college chapel, which was in the 18th century regarded as one of the greatest monstrosities to be erected. So it was being built when Johnson first came here as an undergraduate, but the rest of the quad didn't exist at all. There was just works being carried out on this. So, there are about 40 students and fellows in total, and that would be all. So you would know, Johnson would have made his presence felt because he would know simply everybody in the college and everyone would know him. So, so you can't be inconspicuous, you can't fade into the background if you're in a college of only 40 people. So he was, and this would be, up here, would be where his rooms were, so in the gatehouse, so, which we can go and have a look at. Right, lovely, that's good. Let's go up here. So you have to imagine these stairs in Johnson's time would be no lighting. Oxford, 18th century Oxford is just full of hierarchy. So, and where you lived proclaimed very visibly the kind of student you were. So Johnson may have defined himself as a gentleman, but his rooms, as you can see, were not necessarily those pertaining to gentleman-like status. This would have been the bedroom, hardly larger than a cupboard as it is recorded at the time. I mean, he'd been reading assiduously for years before that, so he came equipped with a massive store of knowledge. And it was in this room that he would have set his 100 volumes, which he came equipped with, you know, on horseback, travelling these 76 miles from Lichfield. So this is where it all happened, where he would have written his essays and prepared his themes. Well, Johnson's account of his time here is that he disregarded all power and all authority. And I think that's what we can see almost from his first moments in the college. I mean, his first week, he's missing tutorials, which is certainly something you wouldn't expect a student in their first week of their course to do. He writes extraordinary good pieces of work, but not necessarily the ones he was asked to write. He goes off sliding when he should be attending lectures. He goes off drinking in taverns when he's supposed to be on college premises. And again, this is this extraordinary. In your first week as an undergraduate, you expect this, you know, extraordinary, dutiful, you know, observance of everything you're supposed to do. But there's Johnson willfully taking the opportunity to slide instead. So, and this was the source of the first of Johnson's many fines in the college, actually, where he was fined tuppence, as he said, for a lecture not worth a penny, which also is not guaranteed to give you an easy passage through the college.
When Johnson arrived at Oxford, he appears to have been ashamed of his family circumstances, deciding to register as the son of a gentleman rather than the more appropriate title of tradesman. The college record books of the time contain further clues to Johnson's life at Oxford.
Okay, fine. And these are the battles books for 1728 and 1729, and these contain all the records of the expenditure of every individual student and fellow in the college. And they're written in an as yet unbroken 17th century code, which if we could break it would be absolutely wonderful. And then there's Johnson there. And as you can see, lots of annotations for Johnson always below the line, and these are the things that, were we able to break this code, would tell us an awful lot more about what Johnson was like as an undergraduate.
Do you think some of them are fines?
Some are fines. It's not very clear on this particular one. He's obviously being a good boy at this point, but if we went over to this one over here, we can see a lengthy and firm black mark here. So he has a black mark against his name below the line. That is very clearly a fine here, and that's in October. I always rather like the graffiti at the end. I get pages like these, actually. I've always scrutinised these extensively to see whether there's anything for Johnson here. There's lots of mollies, which suggests that maybe the college wasn't as single-sex as we suspect, or Molly seems to be here quite a lot, and Sophia. There's a Sophia as well somewhere. There's quite a lot about Johnson's friends. Here's Philip Jones. Jones is a foppish dog, and come forth Philip Jones and pay, you know, answer your charge for exceeding the battles again. So Johnson wasn't really keeping company. That led him to keep maybe the most economical ways in the college. After 13 months, Johnson had to pack up his belongings. It's thought Johnson left because he'd run out of money. And he didn't make any effort, as far as we can see from the college records, to modify his spendings or to exist more economically while he was here. So he has a very sort of sustained level of expenditure. His 8 shillings a week from beginning to end, and then suddenly the record stops halfway through 1 week and Johnson disappears off the college books.
Johnson returned to the family bookshop in Lichfield, where his father was now seriously ill and soon to die. He was expected to take over the business, but after Oxford he thought that selling books was beneath him.
I remember once I was disobedient to my father. It wasn't long after I'd returned from Oxford. In truth, it was just weeks before he died. I refused to accompany him to Uttoxeter Market, where he went regularly to sell books. He'd asked me for help. He needed my help, and despite his condition, I withheld it. Only a few years ago, I decided to atone for this fault. So I went to Uttoxeter in very bad weather. I stood for hours, bareheaded in the rain, on the very spot where my father's bookstall used to stand. I stood in contrition. It was my penance, my atonement. I'm so ashamed.
Having turned his back on the family business, Johnson sought to make a living from writing. He wrote a number of essays for the Birmingham Journal and was paid £5 for translating Father Jerome Lobo's Voyage to Abyssinia. And then in 1735, Johnson made a rather unlikely marriage.
You might not know this, but Johnson was actually the original toy boy, as he married a widow who was more than 20 years older than himself when he was in his mid-20s. She was claiming 40 at the time and was probably nearer 45, 46. Perhaps as an older woman, she saw something in Johnson that perhaps a younger woman who would only look at the surface of things would not see. Tetty, as he called her, Elizabeth Porter, always strikes me as quite a sad character, as she gave up a lot to marry Johnson. She never really again had her own home until she moved here, and by then really her poor health meant that she couldn't really enjoy it.
We all know that love can manifest itself in some quite bizarre ways, but it's certainly the great puzzle of Johnson's life is that he married this woman who seems so wrong, not an intellectual, so much older, almost a mother figure. One suggestion is he may originally have been interested in her daughter, but the daughter spurned his advances and so he turned to the mother. People who have an antipathy to Johnson have cast all kinds of cynical aspersions on what the marriage was all about, that it wasn't consummated, or that Johnson was incredibly inept when it came to lovemaking, and so Tetty pretty quickly showed him the door on that front. It's fascinating to speculate about, but there's very little first-hand information.
Johnson's literary career failed to take off, so he decided instead to set up this school just outside Lichfield, using his wife's money. But the school also failed, attracting only a tiny number of pupils, as prospective parents were deterred by Johnson's very eccentric behaviour.
Dr. Johnson is probably the best example of Tourette syndrome within history. It's certainly the best described case, I think. This is a quote from Fanny Burney. She described Johnson by saying, "His mouth is almost constantly opening and shutting as if he were chewing. He has a strange method of frequently twirling his fingers and twisting his hands. His body is in a continual agitation, seesawing up and down. His feet are never a moment quiet, and in short, his whole person is in perpetual motion." Here's another passage from Boswell's Life of Dr. Johnson. He made various sounds with his mouth, sometimes giving half a whistle, sometimes clucking like a hen. And these sound to me like phonic tics. My view about how Tourette's works is that any one time in all of our brains there are a whole range of motor phenomenon and behaviour that are competing to be expressed, but that a part of our brain called the striatum filters all of them out and only lets through those bits of behaviour which are appropriate to the circumstance. In Tourette syndrome, that filter, or as other people have called it, a firewall, isn't working for some reason. Most people with Tourette syndrome have obsessions and compulsions. This is what Boswell notes. He had another peculiarity. This was his anxious care to go out or in at a door or passage by a certain number of steps from a certain point, or at least so that either his right or his left foot, I'm not certain which, should constantly make the first actual movement when he came close to the door or passage. That's a wonderful example of what I call a just right compulsion, which are very common in Tourette syndrome. It's a feeling of having to do or say or think something, so it's absolutely just right, and if you don't do it in that way, you have to go back and do it again. So it doesn't surprise me at all that Dr. Johnson wrote an English language dictionary, because I think his characteristic, which is Obviously, having to do or say or think something so that it's just right would be a personality characteristic which would very much suit a dictionary writer. I think he wouldn't rest until he felt that the definition of the word was just right, and that would allow him to feel comfortable mentally. And I would imagine if he hadn't have settled upon exactly the right definition, he would have suffered from a mental uncomfortableness.
Despite the many handicaps that Johnson faced, he resolved to resume his literary ambitions and set out for London in March 1737.
People talked about Grub Street, which was not so much a physical space as a kind of state of mind. There was this culture of jobbing authors, hacks, who turned out pieces to order. And Johnson saw himself as definitely having the capacity to kind of participate in that. However, his whole sort of physical bearing meant that when people saw him, they thought, Covent Garden Porter, that's you. And so actually a lot of people turned him away. But it was here, at St John's Gate in Clerkenwell, that he got his first big literary break. This was where the Gentleman's Magazine was based. The Gentleman's Magazine was run by a man called Edward Cave, who, like Johnson, was a native of the West Midlands. And Cave recognised Johnson's abilities and quickly employed Johnson as someone to write reports of parliamentary debates and all kinds of other topical pieces. And this was really where Johnson served his apprenticeship as a jobbing author. It was a very modest living, and it's certainly clear that he lived a hand-to-mouth existence, constantly moving from one abode to the next, and it was precarious. And it was during that time that he consorted with some of London's sort of dodgiest characters. He had one particular friend, Richard Savage, who was a destitute and badly behaved poet, who was at one point accused of murdering someone in a coffee house brawl. And Johnson would associate with people like Savage and often stay out all night and sleep in the street. And this was a guy who was definitely, quite close to the gutter. And this was formative in terms of developing his sense of really, I think, urgency about his professional career, but also his humanity, that he knew about, the wretches who were one whole stratum of kind of London life. And certainly the Gentleman's Magazine was a very important cultural organ of the period, and it gave him a kind of platform. And it was like sort of doing work experience. He was able to acquire a kind of plethora of different skills, all of which would be useful in due course. These days people who want to be writers have all kind of noble aspirations that they start out with. Johnson was much more nuts and bolts in his approach, and he worked up from the ground and learned all kinds of useful things about, shorthand and reporting and kind of, he was a sort of book muncher. I kind of like to think of him as this sort of, omnivore almost out there in the literary wilderness.
Johnson was in his late 20s when he arrived in London. Famously, he loved the city. It stimulated him. It set him in an intellectual community that had been missing since his Oxford days.
You must understand that every man has his genius, and it's true to say that the great rule by which all excellence is achieved and success is procured is to follow that genius. My own particular genius, as you will have observed during our conversations, is manifested in extreme ways. I'm either very silent or very noisy, very gloomy or very merry, very sour or very kind. What you must understand is that with due submission to Providence, a man of genius is seldom ruined but by himself.
The literary London that Johnson was revelling in during the 1730s and 40s was a fast-changing world. Where once literature had been the plaything of aristocratic patrons, a new professionalism was emerging. Bookseller publishers were assuming a new importance. What they could sell on the market determined which projects were commissioned, and it was a group of 6 such booksellers who got together in 1746 and identified the need for a definitive dictionary of the English language.
The dictionary was a bookseller's idea, a publisher's idea. I think it's no accident that all Johnson's great projects, and the dictionary was the first and the greatest, were actually, first of all, devised and proposed by booksellers. Many of Johnson's most famous quotes are quotes about the desirability of commercial endeavour in the world of literature. No man but a blockhead writes except for money. The booksellers are patrons of literature.
The desire to have a good English dictionary fitted in with a lot of things that were going on at the time. It was a period of codification, anthologies, and also the creation of sort of national monuments. You know, at approximately this time, you get things like the British Museum, the Royal Academy of Arts. There's suddenly this idea that arts should be institutionalised, and institutionalising English is part of that process.
Italy had a standard dictionary. The Académie Française had produced a dictionary for the French language, and England had nothing. So there was a perceived lack. The English felt very diffident about their language. They felt that they weren't keeping up with the competing nations in Europe. So we needed an English dictionary to compete with other European nations.
We have to remember that Britain is a new concept at the time. You know, the Act of Union had only happened in 1707, so Britain at the time when Johnson starts on the dictionary is about 40 years old, and there's this sense that you have to have a sort of programme of Britishness and things, an image of Britishness being projected.
The dictionary was a huge project, and it's extraordinarily perceptive of this group of London booksellers that they picked Johnson. I mean, a lot of it was because of one man in particular, a very influential bookseller called Robert Dodsley, who was a friend of Johnson's, had become a friend of his, and had a sense of his extraordinary talents and his extraordinary erudition. A man born to grapple with libraries, somebody said about Johnson.
Johnson signed a contract with the booksellers in June 1746. He would be paid 1,500 guineas over a period of 3 years, enough to pay Johnson a living wage, to hire a team of helpers, and to rent a large house off Fleet Street, number 17 Gough Square.
He'd been commissioned to write the dictionary of the English language, and of course this was an enormous project, and he knew that he'd need a large workspace. He saw the famous dictionary garret at the top of the house, and this just inspired him as somewhere that he could really spread out and work, and of course have his assistants.
How long will the money last?
Oh, well, by my reckoning, 3 years. 3 years, they think I'm mad, but 3 years. It's 1,500 guineas, so 500 a year. Oh, do have faith, Dr. Adams. As you can see, we're working hard. We have our methods, we're working hard, and I'm confident that what we're doing will impress. This will be a dictionary like no other. It will be rich in quotations, full of the traces of the finest minds.
Durham's Physico-Theology, Brown's Vulgar Errors.
All worthy of quotation, all full of learning and words well used.
This is great work, but how can you possibly do this in 3 years? You of course know that the French Academy with 40 members took 40 years to compile their dictionary.
Well, 40 times 40 is 1,600, and as 3 is to 1,600, so is the proportion of an Englishman to a Frenchman.
We have on the table a facsimile version of the first edition of the dictionary. You can see from looking at the volumes we have on the table, just by looking at the size of the books, what a massive project it must have been. What makes Johnson's dictionary very idiosyncratic is that it contains illustrative quotations after many of the definitions that contain the word that he's trying to define. So you can actually see the word in action, if you like.
And did he have any collaborators on this project?
No, he had what he called his amanuenses, his 6 copyists. They helped with the actual copying out, but it seems that the brainwork came from Johnson himself.
It's a popular myth that Johnson's dictionary was the first dictionary of the English language. In fact, there had been several before. But whereas earlier dictionaries had offered little more than simple synonyms, Johnson wanted his dictionary to go further. He wanted to offer more elaborate definitions and to give examples of words as used by the finest authors.
One of the first things Johnson did was to have a look at pretty much all the existing dictionaries. And I think he initially considered the possibility of sort of drawing up a word list by plundering what was already there. But after a time, he realized this wasn't a very effective methodology. And instead, he decided, and this is a radical decision and an influential one, that he would start with books rather than with the alphabet. So what he does is he sets about what he calls the perusal of English literature, and he looks at about 2,000 books by about 500 authors from approximately the previous 200 years.
We can detect the records of other dictionaries, other lexicographers within Johnson's dictionary, but Johnson's making it very much his own dictionary. And a lot of it is stocked from Johnson's extraordinary memory, because he had this amazingly retentive memory, that many of the quotations that appear in the dictionaries are ones that he himself remembered. They're not always entirely accurate because they are the product of memory. And the writers Johnson admired are the ones located in the past. Although this is a dictionary of the English language, 1755, the mass of evidence within this dictionary comes from the past, the kind of legitimizing heritage, if you want. So there's the writers who dominate are Shakespeare, Milton, Dryden, Pope, the canonical greats of the past. And their usage is often used to exemplify a state of language which is quite different to that of the mid-18th century.
For 3 years, Johnson made rapid progress, selecting the very best quotations to bolster his definitions, showing language in action.
Bed presser, a heavy, lazy fellow. This sanguine coward, this bed presser, this horseback breaker, this huge hill of flesh. Shakespeare. Bidental, having 2 teeth. Ill management of forks is not to be helped when they are only bidental. Swift. Fopdoodle, a fool, an insignificant wretch. Where sturdy butchers broke your noddle and handled you like a fopdoodle. Hudibras. Science, certainty grounded on demonstration. Science perfects genius and moderates that fury of the fancy which cannot contain itself within the bounds of reason. Dryden. Oats, a grain which in England is generally given to horses, but in Scotland supports the people. The oats have eaten the horses. Shakespeare. Kixie-wixie, a maid word in ridicule or disdain of a wife. Abecedarian, he that teaches or learns the alphabet or first rudiments of literature. Dull, not exhilarating, not delightful, as to make dictionaries is dull work.
We have a few examples that have survived of the books Johnson used when he was making the dictionary, and they're completely ruined. Some of these books he borrowed from friends, and he went through, he found a word used in a way that he liked, in a quotation he admired, or sometimes expressing a sentiment he thought worth expressing. And he would underline that word, mark off with vertical lines the whole passage he wanted quoted, write the initial letter of the word in the margin for his helper hacks, his amanuenses. And they would go through the business of transcribing the whole quotation, cutting them out and slips and arranging them in alphabetical order. But Johnson was he was gutting books, really.
But Johnson wanted his dictionary to be far more than just an anthology of English literature. In an age where science, industry and knowledge were all expanding rapidly, what Johnson had in mind was something closer to an internet for the 18th century.
The way a modern internet search engine works is it automatically seeks out knowledge from all over the world and pulls it together into a gigantic database. Johnson worked in much the same way when he put together his dictionary. He sat down and read literally thousands of books and marked out quotations, trying to find the most interesting passages, trying to put together a systematic and synoptic view of the knowledge of the 18th century. And he assembled more than 100,000 of these quotations to serve as a kind of database or information bank of everything that was known and everything that was worth knowing. Entries on history and politics and biology, tables of logarithms for people interested in mathematics, one entry on the mating habits of elephants, another on the medicinal value of opium. He said he wanted that all of the quotations would do more than simply illustrate the meaning of a word. He wanted them to teach things. Johnson provided a book that was, in some ways, the search engine of the 18th century.
But Johnson's great ambition was not easily achieved. He'd prepared the dictionary as far as the letter U when the printers returned the proofs for A and B. Reading them, Johnson was massively disappointed, as he realized that he'd completely underestimated the complexity of language.
Well, I think when Johnson starts on the evidence of the plan of the dictionary that he publishes in 1746, he thinks that the dictionary is going to legislate, that it's going to be a prescriptive dictionary. It's going to guard the language against corruption and innovation. And Johnson seems to think of himself as a controller of words when he starts. By the time he's finished, he's completely changed his mind, and indeed ruefully characterises his earlier ambitions. This is like trying to sort of stand against the waves, trying to lash the winds, he says. You can't do this. The language has a life which you can at best try to record, but you can't, as it were, make decisions about which words should or should not be used.
One of the things that we need to understand is that Johnson started out with a slightly restrictive sense of how many different applications any given word might have. He thought that really a word could have at most about seven, well, not about, 7 applications. But in the course of his reading, he found that, some words had 20 or 30 or 100 different applications. I think he says that the verb to take has 134 different applications, and he ends up expending about 8,000 words on explaining all of those.
I think what must have caused the problems for him was when he reached the verbs. And in the letter A, as it happens, there aren't really very complicated verbs in the English language, but there are plenty in the letter B. So it must have been when he got to the letter B and he encountered verbs like the verb to bear, for example. He must have realised that not only are there lots of different meanings of the verb to bear, there are also phrasal verbs, including the verb to bear up, to bear down, to bear away, and so on. And he wouldn't have realised that before he started because previous dictionaries didn't have phrasal verbs.
Johnson decided that all that he had done so far needed revision. It was too expensive to reprint the entries for A and B, but he was determined that everything else should be rethought.
The text just didn't match his expectations. It wasn't the kind of dictionary he wanted to write. So he refused to send the rest to the printer. We do know that Johnson must have got a letter from the proprietors because we've got his reply to the letter. And the reply to the letter is a very strong rejection of what seemed to have been threats from the proprietors. The proprietors seemed to have threatened that they would storm his house and take away the materials that he had in it and print the dictionary, whether he wanted them to or not.
You want me to give in? They want us to give in. They want more of this stuff. It's a waste of ink.
What we've done is good. It's what you said we'd do, what you told us. And then?
I don't care what I told you. It's poor. We need more space. We need more time. We need more definitions. We need more examples. The English language is rich, and this is poor. A schoolboy could do better. And we need less bothering from those printers. Go and tell your masters I'll come when I'm ready. I will not be bullied. I'll not be bullied. I will not be bullied.
But the printers continued to hound Johnson. He set aside the dictionary, and feeling wretched and guilty, he now entered one of the many periods of depression that dogged his life.
Here we have Johnson's prayers and meditations, which were left, the manuscripts of which were left to the college. And what we can see here is a kind of Johnson's own accounting, actually, of his life to himself. They often record his sense of penance for not having achieved what he hoped to achieve. There's a very transparent sense of guilt often. And his prayers, this is one very early one here from 1749, where we can see his sense of religion and his devoutness, but also this prayer for strength to sustain him and enable him to improve. They're often quite depressing reading, actually, revealing a much more tortured sense of Johnson, the man. Actually, oddly, never very witty, never very pithy, never very epigrammatic. It's much more somebody searching their own conscience for what they should have done and what they have not done and what they hope to do and improve in the future.
Johnson says that when he started on the dictionary, he had imagined what he would do was wander amongst the groves of poesy, that he would delightedly sample from all the kind of great literary works, but also the works of learning and science, and that this would be a rather delicious and instructive thing. But then he says these were the dreams of a poet doomed to awake a lexicographer. He was in many ways what we would call a depressive, a person in particular possessed by sort of religious terrors. He apparently kept a padlock and chain at the house of his great friends Mr. and Mrs. Thrale, who lived in Streatham. This padlock and chain which he presented to Mrs. Thrale were there if he should ever go mad. He was to be restrained and locked up, and he feared madness as a kind of constant presence.
What's this? Fleshquake. A tremor of the body.
I know. I watched him walking through the street yesterday. The mere sight of him. Children were running away from him. Quite literally.
Where was he going? To the ladies in the mitre, no doubt.
Who could blame him?
By 1750, Johnson could no longer afford to pay for the amanuenses, and they had to be laid off. But he still had other bills to pay. His sick wife needed constant medical care, and a wage had to be found for her companion.
Mrs. Desmoulins, is my husband upstairs?
Yes. He's resting.
There's not another man works as hard.
Johnson chose to try to solve his financial problems by starting a magazine, The Rambler, a collection of essays often characterized, like so much of his writing, by a maudlin sense of disappointment in his own failings.
You would not deny me a place among the most faithful votaries of idleness. How often have I sitten down to write and rejoiced at interruption, and how often I have praised the dignity of resolution determined at night to write in the morning, and deferred it in the morning to the quiet hours of the night.
It was almost 2 years before Johnson returned to the dictionary and faced up to the publishers.
They had paid for a dictionary and he hadn't completed it. He'd reneged on his contract and he knew it, and he must have felt remorseful about that, and he must have known that they were right. So I think that probably was a kick-start for him to start the project again, and he must have gone back to it at that point and tried to resurrect it and tried to complete it. But this time, of course, he's got very little money, and he gets a new contract with the publishers. They agree to give him a guinea per sheet, per printed sheet. So he's getting some more money, but it's not a great deal of money, so he can only employ 2 amanuenses to help him.
After a period of inertia, in 1751, Johnson really plunged himself back into his world of work. He was kind of galvanized. He was excited by the task in hand again. And at the same time that he was working very zealously, he also started socializing a lot more. And it was to little taverns like this that he would come, little places tucked away in kind of nooks and crannies of London. And he would throw himself back into that intimate social life, not necessarily drinking very much, but enjoying social pleasures. Went well for him until March of 1752, when his wife, Tetty, died. That was crushing, that was disabling. He suddenly became incredibly introspective, introverted. He stopped socializing. He was really disabled with grief, with the return of the black dog of melancholy. He stopped coming to places like this. He stopped doing anything. He certainly stopped work on the dictionary. And there was a period then, a kind of hiatus, where he was just blank. But he pulled himself out of this. And the way this seems to have happened, really, is that his house in Gough Square began to fill up with people like Francis Barber, the young Jamaican servant boy who came to live with him, and new friends. His house became a sort of menagerie of eccentrics, strange people on the fringe of literary society, come into his household and invigorate him and fill him with, not exactly joie de vivre, but some kind of appetite for life and ultimately for work.
Amongst the new arrivals at Johnson's house was a 12-year-old recently liberated slave, Frank Barber. Barber became a surrogate son to Johnson and lived with him until Johnson's death, when Barber was left the sum of £750 and Tetty's wedding ring. There was Robert Levitt, a somewhat disreputable self-appointed doctor, who'd picked up much of what he knew about medicine from conversations overheard in a cafe near a medical school in Paris. There was a blind poetess, Anna Williams, who claimed to have taken part in the first experiments leading to the discovery of electricity, and Mrs. Desmoulins, Tetty's companion, who later told Boswell that she'd received numerous amorous advances from Johnson, who even groped her on occasions.
I mean, it must have been a chaotic household with all these different people living in it. Johnson does say that there were frequent arguments. The inhabitants didn't get on with one another, so they rowed with each other frequently. So it can't have been an easy household to live in. But Johnson doesn't seem to have minded that. He didn't mind people rowing with one another. What he hated was being alone. He really feared being left alone. He delayed and delayed. He didn't do the job because he couldn't face up to it. He didn't know how to do it. He had these problems on it and he didn't know how to solve the problems. But then once he's stirred into action, he really gets going and he produces 80% of the dictionary in less than 2 years with the help of just 2 amanuenses.
Good evening, ladies, doctor.
If Johnson had done this in a university setting, it would have been a different dictionary. It probably would have been much better organised. He probably would have had easier access to materials that would have given him, for example, better etymological information. But I'm not sure it would have been a better dictionary.
After 9 years, Johnson's labours were complete. But before he would allow the dictionary to be printed, Johnson wanted to be sure of one last detail.
Even after all his labours, on the dictionary. There was one thing that Johnson had to do before he was prepared to set it before the general public. And we can actually see evidence of what that one thing was on the title page. These letters after his name, A.M. Today we would say M.A. We may recall that Johnson left Oxford almost 30 years before without a degree. This was something that had rankled during the intervening years. He felt that he needed some kind of badge of his academic credentials, his authenticity as a scholar, to put on the title page to lend credibility, really, to his publication. And so he badgered some of his Oxford contacts to make this happen. And until they did make it happen, he wasn't prepared for the dictionary to be released. And those letters were vital to his realization as a fully fledged man of academe.
Finally, on April the 15th, 1755, the dictionary was published. 2,000 copies were printed, initially selling for a costly £4.10 each, but swiftly followed by cheaper editions, serializations and abridgments.
It made him a kind of national figure. And then, as now, it simply struck observers as an extraordinary thing for one man to do. Yet for several years afterwards, though he was now a known author, a great man, Dr. Johnson, he was still quite hard up. He had to give up the house at Gough Square, probably because he couldn't afford the rent anymore. Indeed, actually, the year after it was published, he was being arrested for debt and bailed out by his acquaintance, the novelist Samuel Richardson. And it was only really in 1762, 7 years later, when George III, the young George III, gave him a pension, a generous pension, that he escaped financial need for the first time in his life.
Johnson continued to write for the rest of his life, including a novel, Rasselas, an edition of the works of Shakespeare, and a number of essays on the lives of Britain's greatest poets. His reputation made, he was the king of literary London. He held court in various salons and coffee houses, and of course there was always Boswell, noting down his every word for posterity.
Dictionaries are like watches. The worst is better than none, but the best can't be expected to go quite true. Much of my life's been lost to the pressure of disease. Much, I confess, has been trifled away. But it will all have been worthwhile if by my efforts foreign nations and distant ages can gain access to the propagators of knowledge and understand the teachers of truth. Whether by my writing I've added anything to English literature, time alone will be my judge. But if the dictionaries fail to do justice to our language, then I've only failed in something which no human powers had hitherto completed. I believe I knew very well what I was undertaking. I believe I knew very well how to do it. And I believe I did it very well.
Johnson never stopped working on revised editions of his dictionary, 4 of which were published before his death in 1784.
In the 18th and 19th century, people, very shortly after death, often had these, sometimes wax, sometimes plaster casts made of their faces and the upper part of their bodies. Johnson's death mask was, I believe, commissioned by Johnson's friend and executor, Sir Joshua Reynolds. It's extraordinary. As you look at the death mask, you have this incredible sense of really seeing Johnson as a person, much more than in the paintings, which present this kind of sanitized vision of what he was like. To me, this feels, even though it's, ironically, it's something that's been done after Johnson's death, It's something which has this incredible life about it. You're really able to read something about Johnson's personality, to see what the living, breathing, talking Johnson must have been like. I mean, it's a very large head, and you get the impression that these would have been very expressive features, but that the default expressions wouldn't necessarily have been, you know, a broad smile. I mean, the mouth is sort of twisted in a strange kind of rictus. I know that that might just be death, but there is a sense that it's not a happy mouth. There's something about this face which suggests, I think, unhappiness.
Scrofula, a deprivation of the humours of the body. Lichfield, city of the dead. Fleshquake, a tremor of the body. Grub Street, a street in London much inhabited by writers of small histories, dictionaries, and temporary poems. Pension, pay given to a state hireling for treason to his country. Lexicographer, a writer of dictionaries, a harmless drudge.
Over 250 years after its publication, the legacy of Johnson's dictionary endures. It still sets the standard for dictionaries today. The Oxford English Dictionary began life as a revision to Johnson's, and there are still some 1,700 of his original definitions in the current edition.
Johnson must have been enormously proud of his dictionary after he'd finished, because he always referred to it as his book. He doesn't refer to any of his other publications as his book, just the dictionary. And he became known as Dictionary Johnson and was very proud of that nickname. So clearly he thought that was his central achievement of his life.
Some people criticised his favouring some quite unusual words and not including words that perhaps ought to have been in there. So, for example, he doesn't have the word blonde. He doesn't have port as a drink, even though he was certainly familiar with it. He doesn't have the word banknote. But he does have the word retromingency, which means pissing backwards, which is apparently something that hares do. And you might think, well, is that strictly necessary? I think it's actually very good that Johnson included that word, but there were things he left out.
In the preface to the dictionary, he says, as if it were a self-evident truth, the chief glory of every people arises from its authors. And the dictionary is a proof of that as far as he's concerned. And if you were to say in one sentence, what is Johnson's importance? What's the importance of his career? I think you would say he is the person more than any other who invents English literature. It's a sort of repository of cultural values, as a place to go to and as a sort of educational tool as well. And that's what the dictionary really does.
Stay with us as Robbie Coltrane plays Samuel Johnson, joined by John Sessions as James Boswell to recreate the pair's trip to the Hebrides in 1773. That's next.